Today our lesson is Rescue on the Nile from Exodus chapter 1 and 2. Our lesson today starts in the book of Exodus, and Exodus is the second book of the Bible. It's the book we'll be learning from for the next few weeks. The book of Exodus starts after Joseph, who God had made an important leader in Egypt, and Joseph had brought his father, Jacob, and the rest of his family to live in Egypt with him. God had used him to save the Israelite people and also to save the people of Egypt from a great famine. That's when they had no food. He stored up the food, and Joseph was really used by God. In Exodus 1:5, it tells us there were 70 people in Joseph's family, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Joseph and his brothers eventually died, but their children grew up in Egypt and had babies and grandbabies, and as the years went by, those 70 people eventually became a whole nation, the nation of Israel, and they were living in Egypt. And after so many years, the Egyptians had forgotten the good things Joseph had done for them. And when a new king called Pharaoh began to rule Egypt, he didn't know anything about Joseph. He just knew there were a lot of Israelites. In fact, there were so many, it made him pretty nervous. What if this huge group of people joins our enemies in a war? Pharaoh thought. So Pharaoh came up with a cruel plan. Exodus 1, verses 9 through 11, tells us what Pharaoh had his people do to the Israelites. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and come to pass, that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So they made them slaves, and they made them build their cities. The Egyptians made the Israelites work very hard for them. They made life tougher and tougher for the Israelites. They were afraid of the Israelite nation, so they made them slaves and made them work really hard. But no matter how mean the Egyptians were, more and more Israelite babies were being born. The Israelite nation just kept growing, and this made the Egyptians even more nervous. So Pharaoh decided to do something very cruel. He decided to kill some of the Israelites. He told the midwives, that was women who helped with the births of the Israelite babies, that any time a baby boy was born, they had to kill him when the baby was born. Oh no, that's terrible. Well, the midwives weren't going to do that. They must have felt afraid to disobey Pharaoh, but they knew that killing the babies wasn't right, and they wanted to show respect to God. So they let the boy babies live. Pharaoh asked the midwives why they were letting the boys live, and the midwives told him that the mothers gave birth to the babies before they even got there. Well, Pharaoh realized that his plans to control the Israelites were failing. Slavery and oppression weren't working. Telling the midwives to kill the babies wasn't working. So Pharaoh came up with his worst idea yet. Exodus 1:22 tells us Pharaoh's terrible idea. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river. and every daughter you shall save alive. He had a terrible plan. He told them that every Israelite boy that was born was to be cast into the Nile River. Pharaoh was determined to kill Israelite baby boys, wasn't he? Now, about this time, one of the Israelite families, who already had a son and a daughter, had a new baby boy. Of course, the baby's parents were scared that the king might find the baby, but his mother certainly wasn't going to throw her newborn son into the Nile River. She hid him instead. But after 3 months, it was too hard to hide the baby any longer. The baby would cry and was loud, so his mother did something very courageous. She made a basket from plants called reeds and painted it with tar to make it waterproof, and it was called an ark. She put the baby inside and took the basket to the Nile River and set it near the edge of the water. Imagine how she must have felt. She must have been sad and probably afraid, but she knew she had to trust God. She told Miriam, the baby's big sister, to hide in the reeds and keep an eye on the basket to see what would happen. Well, it wasn't long before something did happen. And Exodus 2:5-6 tells us what it was. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. She saw the baby in the basket in the water, and she sent her maids to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. The baby was crying, and she had compassion on him and said, "Oh, this is one of the Hebrews' children." When the princess opened the basket and saw the cute crying baby, Miriam stepped bravely out of the reeds. She must have been afraid, but she stepped out bravely out of the reeds. She went right up to the princess and asked, "Shall I go get a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you?" Pharaoh's daughter thought this was a good idea. So Miriam went to the Hebrew woman, who would be the very best person ever to care for this baby, their own mother. So she ran, and she got her mother. She ran and got the baby's mother. Miriam brought her mother to the princess, and the princess told the mother to take care of the baby and to nurse him for her. The princess even said she would pay her to take care of the baby, her own little boy. So Moses' mother even got paid to take care of him now. What a miracle! When the baby grew older, his mother, whose name was Jochebed, took him to Pharaoh's palace and gave him to the princess. It must have been very hard for her to do that. But she knew God had saved her son's life and would take care of him. And God had a really big plan. Pharaoh's daughter adopted the little boy as her own son, and she named him Moses. Moses was all set to grow up as part of Egypt's royal family. God would use his Egyptian upbringing to prepare him for a big job that he would do someday. We're going to find out about that later. So in this lesson, remember, Pharaoh was afraid of the Israelites, and that's why he was mean to them. That's how he reacted to his fear. He became mean. The midwives, Moses' mother and Miriam, were probably afraid to disobey Pharaoh, but they didn't respond to their fear like Pharaoh did. Instead, they chose to depend on God and do what is right. All of us feel afraid sometimes, right? But we don't have to respond to fear in wrong ways. What is a wrong way to respond to fear? To get mean, to get angry, to lash out. We don't have to respond to fear in wrong ways. If you've ever been in a dark, scary place and couldn't see, you know how good it is to have a flashlight to depend on. When we feel afraid and we can't see what's going to happen, we can trust in something much better than a flashlight. Psalm 56:3 says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." Psalm 56:3. Can you say that with me? What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:3. So when we're afraid, we need to trust in the Lord. Pray and ask God to help us. And there's a little tune to help us remember this verse. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:3. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:3. Maybe you can learn that little tune and remember that verse. And we can depend on God and keep doing what's right. He loves to help us, and we can trust in Him. Whenever we're afraid, trust in the Lord. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:3. So Moses was born to save God's people, the Israelites, from the Pharaoh in Egypt. Did you know that's what he did eventually? He saved the Israelites out of that terrible situation in Egypt. And Moses reminds us of Jesus. Jesus was born to save all people from their sin. So remember, what time you are afraid, trust in the Lord. Don't respond to fear in a bad way, like fighting or being mean or saying mean things. But when you're afraid, lift your eyes to the Lord and pray. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:3. And the Lord will help you.
The Faithful Hall of Fame, Moses. This is Moses.
Hey-o.
Moses was a descendant of Joseph's brother Levi.
Hey.
Joseph and his brothers had many children and grandchildren who lived happily in Egypt. Eventually, a new pharaoh came to power who knew nothing of Joseph or what he had done. This pharaoh feared the Israelites because there was a great number of them living in Egypt, so he wanted to put a stop to their prosperity. Pharaoh made the Israelites slaves. He made them work long, hard hours building up Egyptian cities. But his plan didn't work, and the Israelites grew more in number and in strength.
Eek.
So Pharaoh made a rule that no Israelite boy would be allowed to live in Egypt. This is where Moses' story begins. You see, when Moses was born, his mother saw that he was a special baby, and she kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer keep him a secret, she made a basket and put him in the Nile River among the reeds. Moses' sister stayed to watch what would happen to her baby brother, and soon the Pharaoh's daughter came to the edge of the river. When she saw the basket, she sent her servant to get it. When she saw the baby, she felt sorry for him, thinking he must be an Israelite baby who wasn't supposed to live. Then Moses' sister asked the princess if she would like her to find an Israelite woman to take care of the baby. So Moses' sister went and got her mother. Moses' own mother took care of him until he was old enough to live in the Pharaoh's house, where the princess adopted him as her son. And so, Moses, an Israelite boy who wasn't supposed to live, became the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh and lived in the palace as God prepared him for a great destiny that was only just starting to unfold.
Many hundreds of years ago, the Pharaoh of Egypt was a rich and powerful king. So rich that he had his slaves build great treasure cities where he could store away his vast wealth. This Pharaoh had made slaves of the whole nation of Israel, the people of God, and made them serve him with hard labor. But there came a time when Pharaoh began to worry about something. Everywhere the king went, he could see that a dangerous situation was developing. The Israelites were growing in number so rapidly that the land was filled with them, and that made the king afraid. Because of his fear, the king became more cruel than ever to his slaves. He made their lives so bitter that they cried to God to deliver them from their cruel master. And then an amazing thing happened. The harder the king made them work, the more the Lord blessed them, and the Israelites multiplied and grew in number more than before, for the Lord was making his people strong. At last, this evil-hearted king decided to do something about the situation, something that would weaken Israel as a nation. And so he made up his mind to do a terrible thing. Pharaoh issued a command that every baby boy that was born to the Israelite people be thrown into the river to die. But in one of the slave families of Israel, God was working out a plan of his own. And God chose that very time to send a tiny baby to Amram, the father, and Jochebed, the mother. There were already in the family a daughter named Miriam and a son whose name was Aaron. And then there was the baby, a baby so dear and tender, so innocent and sweet, that some of heaven's glory seemed tangled in his tiny curls. A baby that filled their hearts with joy. But Pharaoh's order had said that all boy babies should die, and this baby was a boy. Whenever the parents looked at him, their joy was turned to sorrow, because the sentence of death hung over this precious child. How could they hide this dear little baby from the eyes of a king whose guards and servants were everywhere? The grief-stricken family knew of only one possible way to keep the baby safe. They would ask God to do it for them. For they believed in a God who was greater than any Pharaoh. And they knew that God's ear is always open to the prayers of his people. Because of her faith in God, the mother was not afraid to disobey the king's command. And as she looked with tender love at her son, the slave mother thanked God again and again for the gift of this wonderful baby. For 3 months, the Israelite woman managed to keep her baby hidden, going as usual about her daily tasks. But every day, the little boy grew bigger and bigger. And every day, the hope of keeping him hidden grew smaller and smaller. Just like all babies, the child would cry once in a while. And if one of Pharaoh's guards should ever hear the child, the mother realized that her son would be torn from her arms and thrown into the river to die. She could not hide the boy any longer. Something had to be done, for the whole family was in danger if the child were discovered. Then, just at the right time, God, in his wisdom, gave the mother a most amazing plan. From the banks of the river Nile, the Israelite woman gathered some plants called bulrushes. And in the mother's work to save her son, God was working out a plan to save all the people from their life of slavery. For the mother and her baby and the whole nation of Israel were together in the circle of God's care. And so all that the mother did was part of God's plan. First, the mother took the reeds, and she wove what appeared to be a simple basket. And with each reed, she wove a prayer of faith. But soon the basket changed into a very strange-looking object. For over the basket, the mother put some mud from the river, and over the mud, she spread some pitch. Actually, what the mother made was a small boat, and she called it an ark. No one looking at that queer little ark would have guessed that God had anything to do with it. But God was directing the mother every step of the way. Inside the ark, the mother made a nice, soft little bed. Then came the hardest part of all. Into the carefully prepared little bed, the mother put her beloved son. She tucked him in tenderly, and with a prayer in her heart, closed the basket over his rosy little face. Then, with Miriam by her side, the mother carried her precious bundle to a place that she knew along the edge of the river Nile, and she left the ark there in the reeds at the river's brink, a lonely little speck beside that great river. Only the sister Miriam was stationed near enough to see the ark. She would watch what happened to her baby brother. All at once, Miriam leaned forward and listened. By the sound of voices, she knew someone was coming. And when she saw that everything was happening just as they had expected, Miriam's heart began to pound with excitement. Walking slowly down toward the banks of the river was one of the most important people in all of Egypt, the princess of Egypt herself. Pharaoh's daughter had come down to the river to bathe. For a while, neither the princess nor the maidens noticed anything unusual. But when the princess came down to the edge of the water, she saw the strange object almost hidden among the reeds. Right away, the princess was curious. Whatever could be inside such an odd-looking thing? A baby in a kind of a boat. But the baby... Oh, the baby was a perfectly lovely child, the most beautiful baby the princess had ever seen, fit to belong to a king. And when the dear little baby started to cry, the daughter of Pharaoh found her heart melting with pity and love, just as God had planned. She knew that this was one of the Hebrew babies her father had tried to destroy, but the princess longed to save it. And since she had found this precious child, she decided to keep it for her own. When Miriam saw the princess take the baby up so gently and begin to comfort him, she knew that her brother's life was spared. But God's plans for the baby didn't end here. And so God encouraged Miriam to do something few slaves would dare to do. She went to the princess to ask a very bold question. Miriam trembled with eagerness as she spoke to Pharaoh's daughter. "Shall I go and call a nurse for you?" And when the princess of Egypt said, "Go," Miriam ran to call the child's own mother to be the nurse. Not only was their baby going to be safe, he would be watched over and cared for by his very own mother. But God, in his infinite wisdom and love, had wrought a far more wonderful thing than they knew. Here was a baby born into slavery, but God had given him two mothers. One, the princess of Egypt, with the power and wealth of a kingdom to offer him. The other, his real mother, who knew the Lord and would teach the child to love and to obey him. In this way, God was preparing this child to do a great work. For this little child was the baby Moses, sent by God to his people Israel. And the same Moses would one day lead them out of the land of Egypt, out of their life of slavery, to a promised land of plenty that flowed with milk and honey.
Many years after God's people moved to Egypt, there came a new king who had never known Joseph. The Egyptians called their kings Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was mean and made the Israelites his slaves. The Egyptians were mean too. They made the Israelites work harder and harder. One day, Pharaoh had a thought.
There are too many Israelites, and they are too strong.
So he thought up an awful thing to do. He told his servants,
Every time an Israelite baby boy is born, you must throw him into the river.
That was terrible. One day, an Israelite woman had a beautiful baby boy. She decided to hide her baby. It was a good choice. After a while, the baby's mother couldn't hide him anymore. So she got a basket and fixed it so the water could not get inside. Then she put the baby into the basket and put the basket into the river. The baby's big sister, Miriam, stayed close by to see what would happen. God was watching over the baby. The Egyptian princess came to the river to take a bath and saw the basket.
Bring me that basket.
Just as her servants brought her the basket, the baby cried out.
Oh, look, it's a little Hebrew baby.
The princess decided to keep him as her son. She named him Moses. Miriam was still watching. Even though she was frightened, she stepped out of her hiding place and asked,
"Would you like me to find a Hebrew nurse to take care of the baby?"
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Miriam ran home and got her mother, Moses' own mother. The princess even paid her to take care of him. This is how God saved baby Moses and gave him back to his mother for a long time.